conversation with Simon Sadler and with Alex Lehnerer from ATH and from University of California. And tomorrow I am sure we'll have a great one with Stephen and Jeremy, that I thank you for joining us in this conversation. And the question we have, and that goes through some of your PhD works, and I think is also now in some of the teaching and research work we do as faculty in the School of Architecture, is the idea that we have been working for a relatively long period with an established set of rules in city making, that these rules were a kind of coded system of behavior that was shared between administration, builders, professional practitioners, and that this set of and were also, I would say, embodied in practices. So they were both stated by law in some cases. I'm thinking, for instance, about the planning rules, the density rules, or even rules we tend not to pay the attention they deserve, which are the rules that define roles in city making. Who makes what? Make an example to make you clear what I'm thinking about. I think that it could be said without the risk of being easily falsified, before the generation of what the French call the Trente Glorieuses, so the 30 glorious years of post-war reconstruction between, let's say, 46 and 76 or 45. It's not about chronology. It was very clear that the activity of producing the space you live in was delegated to specialized bodies, being it the planning authority or the planning office or the building, the permit authority or the architect or the builder. This is something we might take for granted because a generation like mine grew up in that was the world. I mean, nobody I knew when I was a kid was producing its own space. Although sociology was then debunking this idea and saying that also cultural practices and ways of consumption and cultural modes and ways of occupying space are arts de faire, or ways of producing, to quote Michel de Certeau, one you should read when you think about these issues. This is less and less true in these times. It is for many different reasons that we will not list now, but we could take the current crisis we are living through, which might not be any longer a sharp economic crisis. We don't know about that. It is not forecasting, maybe economic forecasting. But I'm sure that there is a growing mismatch between the rules of the game that we inherit from the previous generation and the city and the spaces we need in our cities and what society is producing. Because as I remember having learned while I was in your space, in your seats as a PhD student from at the time my master Roberto Gabetti, was the fact that rarely architecture or planning do produce the innovation. Innovation is produced in society, happens. There is something that social practices and behaviors and actors and entities produce, and then we can recognize, give it form. But we also risk, and this is one of the reasons why I launched the idea of this course, we also risk now to kill innovation and new practices by applying old rules. I see it happening in practice. I see it happening, things that could change pieces of city that are prevented from being possible and becoming real because they don't fit the frame we inherited from the past. So this is why we chose, together with some of the students that I thank, especially Lucia and Michela this time for lending their hand and thinking about this. We chose these two words, co-production in city making and rules and freedom. We know that today we're talking to Anglo-Saxon experts and scholars, so that there is a great change between common law system, a great difference between common law system and Latin systems. But still, I think that we have a lot of urban coding and rule making and conflict between bottom-up practices and top-down practices happening in our worlds, although they still remain different. I have the impression, for instance, that it could be something we can discuss. The Anglo-Saxon common law system is much more permeable to change than the Napoleonic French and Prussian system that is the birth, the cradle of the way we see the ways authorities should code the behaviors of social actors and communities. Having included the word co-production, there is an inherent idea that we should go towards more open forms of coding. And another line, we mean rules in a very open, way. So this seminar, this discussion, this conversation, I'd say also for you thinking about your work as PhD students and young researchers, it's not necessarily about urban codes, planning rules, density or zoning system. We are really thinking very broadly about how the game between professional, user, practitioner, producers, authorities, constructor, builders happen in our cities. I will not say more. The last time I made an introductory conversation. This time I will not be making it because we are more interested in seeing what happens at the end of the story. So Michela will introduce us our two lecturers of today, Jeremy and Stefan, that I thank again. And I would like for all the students not to hang. I see also many colleagues, and I thank them for being here. It is not always faculty members come to this kind of event, so it's a great pleasure to have you also here. And I think that we will go through both lectures, and I propose to keep any question and answers for the end, so that we have one wholesome conversation. And I invite kindly and warmly each one of you to prepare questions during their lectures, so that we don't have the usual leap in the void at the end of the. I think that happens also in your school, despite a common phenomenon.
So good afternoon to everybody, and especially to our guests. I would like to thank for being there, of course, but for all of you. I would like to make a little bit the link with the first day of this course, because I think that some interesting questions raised up from the first day, and I would like just to point them out so that we can maybe also make reference to them. Simon Sadler, describing his approach about non-plan, especially cited a very interesting quote about Gordon Matta, which was about the heritage of the non-plan culture, saying that what they had to offer to us through the contemporary age is the confusion guided by a clear sense of purpose. And this question of the purpose of the rule seems to me very important, and seems a good point to start today in our introductory speech. The second speaker of last time was Alex Lehnerer. You already know the author of Grand Urban Rules. So introduced the concept of rules as an alternative to plan, but not an alternative to freedom. For him, in fact, the rule is something that can enable to have more freedom. So, what this approach, I think, put on the discussion as a new question is the idea of what kind of rule, what form is the form of the rule we are discussing about. And that is the second important point, so the form of the rule, not only the concept of the rule. Then, speaking about the contemporary condition, I think we should focus a little bit on the relationship of the three main families of planning tools, which I would name the plan, the code, and the spatial agency. is there any possible relationship that is not only a hierarchical relationship as we are used to see between land and code, for example, or is it only an alternative method, or can they be complementary in a sense? And then this very brief introductory speech will end with some contemporary open challenges and some suggestions I would like to discuss, especially with our guests, but maybe also with the students during the debate at the end of this day. So I'm not going to do a story of rules, of course. By the way, Matteo did a wonderful panorama of historical evolving rules last time, so I cannot do the same. But I would like to point out some aspects. At the beginning, urban rules, the purpose of urban rules was not to rule the form, the morphology of the city, but more to rule the flow of the city. The city was conceived as a crossroad in the ancient time, commercial crossroad, political crossroad, even social crossroad, because the main social structure were located in the city. So the rules, the regulation, concern only the practical, the functional aspect of the city, and not the form, the morphology of the city. Everything changed in my mind at the Renaissance, where the aesthetical intention arises, and that becomes a very crucial point in the general culture. And of course, the general search of beauty and harmony involved also the conception of the city. For the first time, the city is represented and is conceived as a whole, as a unity, as an object that can be designed, that can be, drawn in a sense. Of course, this is a new purpose in urban rule that was not in the ancient time. Then another sort of revolution comes in the 19th century with the culture of engineer, the hygienic culture, which point out the importance of the healthy character of the city. So suddenly new rules rule some very some aspect related to good air and to hygiene norm in a broader sense. This was not only for wealthy purpose, of course, but also with a purpose of social control. In the 19th century, of course, we have social insurrection, we have some development of socialist movement and so on. So the elite of the city needs also to control social aspect of the city, and this becomes another important purpose for urban regulation. Finally, we can say maybe that in the 19th century, some aesthetical value would stand in the urban regulation, but not with a goal of harmony and of beauty as in the Renaissance, but much more with an idea of uniformity and of urban decorum. So the purpose slightly changed from the Renaissance idea of the ideal city. Then the modern movement, of course, completely changed again, and the formal aspects of urban morphology are totally abandoned in the urban regulation of the modern movement, or we can say better that they are only consequently to more functional worries about the city. So the morphological aspect of the city not as a purpose but as a consequence of other priorities. But all these different purposes that rules have during the ages also correspond to different forms of the rules. The first rule in the ancient time, the urban rules were written. No representation of the city was attached to this kind of rules. And of course, this changed a lot from what we know now in our urban regulation. When drawings and plans and schemes appear in urban regulation, is not really inside what we could call today urban regulation, but it's more in the theoretical treatise of the Renaissance. And that's a big difference, because this kind of product, this kind of document were not prescriptive. The norm in the ancient time for the city were prescriptive. Treatises are not prescriptive, of course, as you know, but they were able in the Renaissance and also in the following centuries to inform the urban culture and so to make the city to produce great results without being prescriptive. And that's a big change in comparison to our time. So the form deeply changed between ancient time and Renaissance because of the presence of drawing that can describe proportion, morphology, and also architectural form that should characterize the city. Again, when the hygienic culture developed in the 19th century, this tradition of having drawings and images attached to urban regularization withstands, but with a difference. The representation of the city were no more two-dimensional representation. In the Renaissance, most of the images of the city that we have are two-dimensional. Through the new representative tools of perspective, Renaissance architects from Renaissance, theorists from Renaissance, gave us a two-dimensional representation of the city. This doesn't happen anymore in the 19th centuries, where the representation of the city and the planning instrument contains images and drawings and so on, but they were bidimensional representation of the city. So in a sense, we lost a dimension. In the modern age, when complexity of town increased, planning of the modern age seems to concern every aspect of the city. The planning absorb all the city's activity and concern most of the urban fields. But this very rigid, very complex, but almost quantitative system of planning entered a crisis in the 60s. The 60s, with the student movement, a sort of pervasive culture of will of breaking the rules appears, and that, of course, involved the planning too. So this opened the way to many concepts that nowadays we are still practicing and we are still reflecting on them as the plan approach, participatory approach, and especially bottom-up approach. So we come to our day, and I try to establish some relationship with those three main families of planning tool I was mentioning before. So the plan, the code, and the special agents. Of course, the main potential of the plan is to have an overall point of view on the city, and at a territorial scale also. So is an instrument able to control big-scale transformation, and so on. What's the main problem of the plan approach, let's call it like that? The critiques that have been made to the plan approach in recent decades is that it's not so able to... It is a very rigid instrument, firstly, and secondly, it has not been able to guarantee livable environment. So something is missing in this global approach. This critics toward livability of the environment produced is something that the code can maybe help to overcome. Urban codes have been very often recognized able to capture some positive urban character and to, I will not say repeat, but to generate a system, to set a system able to generate again these urban characters. So this is one of the main potential of the code, and another very positive point of the urban code is their capacity of managing large-scale development, keeping the coherence between the original vision of the plan or of the development program and their development during the time, and of course to manage all the different stakeholders that will act together into this kind of large-scale development. Because the code is able to put together, in a sense, the harmony set up by the plan and the variety that happened during the first three critiques that have been moved to this kind of approach. First of all, maybe this kind of approach is too main concern about physical issue and not enough about social issue. Code always regulate the morphology of the city and almost never the social dimension of it. And then another critique which is moved to this kind of regulation is to stifle the creativity, because the codes give a lot of norms and a lot of parameters and so on that may reduce the variety of solutions proposed. Then we come to the third great family, the spatial agency, which in a sense expand the realm of individual and social freedom, because they take together all the different stakeholders trying to make the proposal for transformation emerging from the participation of a very large set of stakeholders, not always expert, or I will say mainly non-expert. And this is the great innovation of this kind of instrument, to bring non-expert people into the conception of the city. Of course, they have critics too. First of all, their effectiveness, because not always non-expert solution will work as well as expert solution. And so the feasibility of the proposal is not always guaranteed. But also there are some issue of power concern when a process like spatial agency is set on. So what I wonder is if it's possible not to consider these three families as alternative, but if it is possible, and some experience has already been run on, to consider this approach not alternative but complementary. So in this sense, could we figure out three main challenges? The first is if ICT technologies and social media could give an effective help in this sense. How? First of all, enabling the co-production of urban coding. What do I mean co-production? The production together of different stakeholders, especially non-expert one. Through many different tools, can be open data, can be crowd design, but especially visualization tools. Because it seems that visualizing the result of the transformation problem is one of the main difficulties of non-expert figure. So if they can, we have Matteo in the audience who is an expert about this kind of visualization tools that are setting up at City, our research institute. So I hope that you will give his support in the final debate. So this is one of the main difficulties for non-experts in understanding the result of their needs and of their design in terms of visualization. And other tools that can be useful in this field are collaborative platform, open source architecture, and some experience in that sense are running on, not really on urban design, but more on the structural field and on the architectural field. And I think that this is because it's more easy to define the element that can be set to be given to the non-expert in architecture and in structure field than in urban design. Then the second challenge I would like to give to you so that we can discuss is not only to use this kind of planning tool for new development, but for regeneration programs, regeneration redevelopment. In the last, in the first day of this course, Matteo Robiglio told us that one of the main challenge was the reuse of the land, the reuse of dismantled area in the cities, and this is exactly what I mean. In this case, of course, the existing building and the social context, which is already set in this case, become a help on one side, but also something's more tough, something's more hard to deal with, of course. And the last The last challenge I would like to let to you to discuss later on is the relationship between these planning tools and the capability of generating a feeling of identity, a sense of community, which is not only about social balance in the new neighborhood or in the regenerated neighborhood, but it's about to strengthen the community sense, setting the rules together. That's what I see as the main meaning of co-production urban coding. To set the rule together, not only speaking about the need of the inhabitant, of course it's important, but not only the need, but also trying to define the element, the urban element, that could help to solve and to fulfill, to solve the problem and to fulfill this kind of needs. So these are the topics I left on the table to discuss with you. And now I would like to introduce our two guests. The first speaker will be Jeremy Teal. I'm sure that the audience already know him, but just two words about him. He's a British architect, an educator and a writer, as I can read in his website, and actually is head of Central St. Martin in London. And after a successful career as a practitioner, now in the last decade, he concentrates on academic studies, focusing on social and political aspects of architecture and built environment. If I am wrong, you can correct me whenever you want.
Sure, fine.
He's the author of three very important books: Flexible Housing, Architecture Depends, and Special Agency. And all three of them won the RIBA Award for Outstanding Research. This is a very great honor because he's the only person who won 3 times this very important prize. So Jeremy Teal develops 2 crucial topics for today's debate, in my mind, but maybe you won't agree with me. First, the relationship between architecture and contingency, explaining how modernity rejects contingency, searching a visual order, which become a form of social order in the end. And the second topic, which seems to be very interesting for us, is the general topic of special agency that I mentioned before. So the special agency approach that conceives architectural production as a network of actors, human and non-human, right? And what they claim is to have to be more proactive than reactive toward the urban renewal system. So exactly the topic of our talk today. And the second speaker that we are going to have after a very short break is Stephen Marshall. Stephen Marshall is professor in urban morphology and planning at the Bartlett School of Planning. You can correct me also. And is also co-editor of Built Environment Journal. His experience both in consultancy and in academia, where his principal interests are in urban morphology and street layout. And he especially focusing on the relationship between urban formative processes and urban morphology. Among his most recent works, we have the book Urban Coding and Planning, almost our title. And of course, in this book, he describes the purposes and potentiality of urban code, as well as the idea of complementarity of code and planning. So, in a sense, we can say that our 2 guests, one is going to play on the side of the rule and the other one on the side of freedom, but I'm not sure they are going to respect their role, and maybe they would like to mix their point of view. So I give them the floor.
Okay, here we are.
Good. I'm very low. Has anyone got a cushion? I feel like a dwarf. Right. I'm going to sit. Is that okay?
You can stand.
I could stand. Has anyone got a... you want me to stand? Is it better to stand? Okay. I'm going to start by talking about participation, which seems to me to be a very problematic word, because we've got a number of words which are so common that we've lost sight of what they actually mean. And particularly, I guess people know this famous thing. I don't even know who Sherry Arnstein is, but she or he is very famous because they did the ladder of participation. I wish I'd done something so simple. And the ladder of participation goes like this. In which there is a hierarchy. What I think is really interesting about the ladder of participation is that over halfway up is the word placation. Therefore, it is argued that it is good simply to placate people through the process of participation. That the whole aspect of participation, or maybe even a co-production, is not really anything to do with citizen control, but really just an act of quietening down the angry masses to placate them. And that, I think, is a very strange starting point for the act of either co-production or of participation. Co-production is different from participation because it has the word production in, which suggests it's active, whereas participation, as you can see, might just be a form of placation. And so I think that, I'm sure that even in Italy, does that look like an Italian co-production scene? Does this happen? You have a map of a town, yeah, and then you stick things on it, and the citizens think that by engaging with the physical map, they are in some way co-producing the map. It's certainly how it's done in the UK with the term called planning for real, as if by the simple act of engagement of the non-expert within the expert conditions of planning, there is something real going on. But I would argue that this is little more than an act of placation. It feels as if people are being involved in the processes of co-production of cities, but actually nothing really is going on. And I think that as experts, we all have to be incredibly careful that we are not in some way simply trying to calm these people down, to pretend that they are in some way involved in the co-production of cities. So that is my first warning. And the political theorist, and I think this is really interesting, this quote. She is talking about participation in political processes, but I think you can also use this quote quite clearly in terms of participation within urban processes, is that actually the choices within urban processes have largely been made either politically or by the expert. And the whole thing of participation or co-production is just a mask which in some way makes it feel better that what has already been decided will be enacted. And I think that that is an important quote because of the sense of power that you as experts, and as PhD students you are experts, or as faculty, have, and how one might in fact abuse that power even though you're taking a liberal stance of co-production. And what Carol Pateman talks about is various types of participation. And I could use the word co-production, but I'm using the word participation. And the first is pseudo-participation, which I think is probably the most common form of participation within urban processes. It feels as if there is participation going on, but the decisions have already been made by the experts, and therefore it is fake. At the other end is the notion of full participation. This is equally dangerous, because there is no such thing as full participation. The only way you could get full participation is by getting every citizen in Torino to vote or to engage with a system of co-production. Participation and co-production is by its very nature partial. It is by its very nature selective and self-selecting. The people who engage in the production of cities, even those who aren't experts, are generally people who have either a vested interest or are in positions of power. And even the most generous bottom-up processes are dominated by a very few people. They're dominated by people who have time or by people who have a voice. It's very rare that the dispossessed, the oppressed, that the non-expert, that the people who are on the margins are involved in the true co-production of cities. So one has to be equally worried about the term full participation. And so it's probably better just to accept that every process of co-production, every process of participation is partial. And I don't know how partial translates into Italian, but in English, partial both means not complete, but it also means that it is biased in some way. I am partial to something. I like something more than something else. And so one has to accept that any system of co-production is partial. I think that's an honest thing to say. Because as soon as you accept that, then you have to accept both that it's incomplete, but also the systems of power which are in any participatory process. I think that the most extreme versions of participation and writing about participation are those by Marcus Meeson, who is very clear that any sense of consensus is a lie. You cannot reach pure consensus. If you do reach any form of consensus in the co-production of cities, you generally reach the lowest level of resolution, around which everyone can agree. That's why when one gets into participatory processes, many of the things that come out are so banal. I like green space. You cannot argue with that, yeah? I like well-being. You cannot argue with that. But actually it's meaningless. They're kind of meaningless terms. And what Marcus Meeson talks about, I think from the point of view of provocation, is Chantal Mouth's notion of agonism. That in any participatory process or process of co-production, you should welcome the fight. You should welcome the sense of agonism, the sense of debate, the sense of freedom actually is multiple, not single. And therefore one has to listen to multiple voices, and they're never going to be in any way resolved into the sense of a consensus. And I would argue that some of the words like codes and rules attempt to reach consensus, which might in the end be a suppression of freedom. Because almost by their very terminology of code and rules, they are things to do with systems and a kind of universal approach as opposed to an approach which will allow a variety of voices and producers. So I suppose all I'm saying is that, to be honest with ourselves, there is no consensus, and to be honest with ourselves, we have to accept the notion of the partial. Now, why I think that participation needs to be discussed endlessly is to do with a condition of ethics. And in particular, the incredible danger within architecture and urban design that ethics is in some way related to aesthetics. That the beautiful city is the moral city. That the Renaissance view of harmony is still with us. That an aesthetic harmony is in some way related to a social harmony. And so through the history of both the Renaissance, and these are all modernist quotes, one gets this incredible sense that in order to behave ethically as architects and urban designers, all we have to do is to behave aesthetically. That in some way our order, our systems of codes, our rules, our various weird sense of language, if we do it well, if we do it honestly, that in some way that is an ethical stance. And for those of you who might have read Architecture Depends, the best chapter is the one on ethics, I think, because it's the most angry chapter. I was furious when I was writing it. I was furious because it was getting to the end of the book and I had a deadline. And so I was kind of just thinking, okay, I've got to get, I've sort of got through, I've been quite sensible up to then. And the chapter on ethics is when I really let loose. And I let loose for this very reason, is that architects and urban designers operate in a sense of what I call phony ethics. An impasse is reached in the phony ethics of architectural discourse. No architect sets out to behave badly or to inflict unhappiness on the world. That's true. That's one reason I love being an educator, particularly at a place like Central St Martin's. There is an absolute inbuilt optimism that everything that the student at Central St Martin's does is for the better. No designer sets out to make the world a worse place. A novelist might write about sadness. A poet might write about suicide. A designer doesn't set out, unless they're quite strange, to make the world a worse place. But my argument is the tools by which they set out to do that are not necessarily ethical. Either using the wrong tools, the tools of ethics, the tools of, a brick, mise en œuvre, everything starts with a brick. It bloody doesn't. It's not true. As soon as you say everything starts with the brick, your world is limited to what you can do with the brick as a formal, tectonic, and aesthetic object. I.e., you are detached from the social life world. And it's only within the social life world that ethics can really reside. And I think that in terms of co-production and rules and codes, this becomes important. Because if as already been talked about, if the rules and codes only concern themselves with the physical and not with the social, then the rules and codes in my book are not operating within an ethical horizon. So, the other really interesting thing, for those of you who are architects here, or indeed planners. Planners are better. Planners actually do have a sense of ethics built into their professional codes. But in the UK, I don't know what it's like in Italy, there is a thing which says if you follow the Architects Registration Board Code of Conduct, it is a source of ethical guidance. That's an amazing thing to say, that if you follow the code, it is a source of ethical guidance. Particularly, and read it in the book, the codes are actually simply to do with neoliberal priorities. They're to do with don't advertise falsely, have enough money in the bank, don't lie to your client, make sure you have insurance. These are the codes, yeah? And yet these are meant to be a form of ethical guidance. And so my argument is that the ethics of architecture and urban design are false, because they're covered by these two things. First of all, aesthetics, and the other is professional codes. And in each of those, you become detached from the social life world. And in that, anything to do with participation is completely kind of denied as a source of ethical projection. And for me, the quote that I use, whoops, do I do that? I think when it became most incredibly poignant to me was in the last decade, when we were building this, and still are building this, with this. When slave labour was being used, and it is slave labour, was being used to produce architectural and urban spectacle. Using many of the rules and many of the codes that are discussed within architectural and urban circles. Now, this could be a much longer debate. We could talk about this for a long time. We could talk about what is the role of the architect, the urbanist within these conditions. Should we say no? I think that's, I'm not going to go there, but all I'm saying is that for me, those days of kind of hysterical abundance before 2008 produced a form of professional hysteria which denied the true forms of production. And the true forms of production were exploitative and incredibly immoral. So when I talk about ethics, I turn to my hero, as I always do, Zygmunt Bauman. And it's a very simple, direct quote, but one which is I always remind myself, and remind my students, what ethics might mean. Because as soon as he says that, and then as soon as you think in your PhD, which might be quite abstract, then it might be quite practical, but let's say it's quite abstract. How do you relate the potential abstraction of your PhD studies to that sentence? i.e., how do you, through your own discourse, have a responsibility for the others? If you accept that as a definition of ethical behaviour. I haven't got the answer. And it's not meant to have an answer. It's just like, it's there. And it's from some of, in a way, it's from not that quote, but that chapter in the book that Tatiana and I came to the notion of spatial agency. And it's worth just talking about how we came to spatial agency. Spatial agency started as a project in 2007. Note the date, because I think it was about the most prescient thing that I've ever done, in which we put in an application to the National Research Council, which was so angry, I can't believe they gave us money. What it was arguing is that it was called Alternative Architectural Praxis. And it was arguing that architectural practice has sold itself to the devil, that it has simply become the velvet glove for the hard fist of capitalism, that it was just dressing up in an immoral manner the forces of production of the neoliberal market and doing nothing to intervene in it. And we wrote all this down. It was a straightforward Marxist critique. And we set off, we got the money, amazingly, and we set off doing this project. And then the crash came, and we thought, yeah, well, actually, we've been proved right, so we've got another 2 years, what do we do now? And the other trouble was we were just actually getting very intellectually depressed, because in the same way as Zygmunt Bauman has become more and more pessimistic as he reads the world through his brilliant lens, it was as if there was no way out. Until we said, okay, we're going to change the title of this project from Alternative Architectural Practice to Spatial Agency. And as soon as we did that, we felt empowered again. We felt useful because of this rather lovely quote from Anthony Giddens. I love this quote. I love this quote because it is so provocative to a professional. A professional hates the idea that things could be otherwise. A professional defines himself as someone who knows what the solution to the problem might be. A professional actually defines himself, as Rainer Banham argues, by setting the problems which only they can solve. And in doing that, and again, this is a warning to yourselves, if your PhD has set a problem that only you can solve, it's not a very good PhD. Why spend 3 years doing that? If you already know the answer, yeah? Why spend 3 years looking for it? It's too painful anyway. What's nice about this quote, though, is that it introduces a more open and generous way of using knowledge. It doesn't use knowledge in an instrumental or offensive in which the professional says it has to be done like this. It introduces knowledge in what I'll come to later in a mutual manner in which knowledge emerges through a discussion with others. Now, I have to say, I think this only works for some professions. I don't want my doctor to act otherwise. I don't want my doctor, if I go in for open heart surgery, to say, I might do a bit of this today and sort of go in this side rather than that side. So I think there are certain forms of professional knowledge in which agency doesn't apply. The issue with architects and urban designers is that they would like to believe that they are doctors. They would like to believe that they have a strong form of knowledge which does not act otherwise. Because that's how they define themselves against the non-expert, against the non-professional. And my argument in most of my writing is that architects don't possess that strong form of knowledge. They try to create that strong form of knowledge through coding, through aesthetic codes, through design codes, or whatever. And each of those are ways in which architects attempt to assert the strength of their knowledge. Whereas my argument has always been that architecture is contingent, as I get to later, and therefore needs a different form of knowledge to cope with this sort of contingent, differing, various set of contexts in which architects and urban designers operate. As soon as you try to impose strong knowledge on top, you cannot act otherwise. So I've done enough on that quote, but I think it's a good one. And we came up with this term spatial agency, and then we thought we needed to try to work out what was and what wasn't. And so we came up with, this is us coding, by the way. So I'm being contradictory here. So we came up with 3 characteristics. The first is the ability to make spatial judgments, by which we are very clear, because we are Lefebvreans, that space is social. Social space. What's the quote? Social in bracket space is a bracket social product, is Lefebvre. i.e. that space is not an abstraction, it is not a set of patterns alone, but it is always related to its social production as well. And the characteristic of spatial agency is an ability to make judgments within that social spatial field. The second, which is the one I want to talk about most, is the notion of mutual knowledge. So I will talk about that. But it's how knowledge arises through mutual discourse rather than through abstract production or instrumental production. And the third, which is too easy in a way, but I think needs to be said, is a sense of critical awareness. And by critical, I'm meaning critical in the Marxist sense of the term, of understanding what has happened understand the past in order to transform the present into a better future. And so what we did is that we looked at everything, we scored everything that came through against these 3 categories, and then I invented an algorithm to say that was in or that was out. So, for example, OMA, so we marked 1 to 5. If you had a 1 in any category, you were out. OMA, I thought, were very, very good on spatial social judgment, pretty good on critical awareness, but hopeless on mutual knowledge. They were out. AMO, the research branch of OMA, were in because we thought actually there was a degree of mutual knowledge going on there. It's all silly, I do realise, but somehow we had to decide what constituted spatial agency and what didn't. What I want to talk about now for the rest is this notion, because I think this is to do with the seminar series in particular, the notion of mutual knowledge and what might constitute mutual knowledge and why it is, as I describe it, first of all a threat, but then an opportunity. Giddens, again, talks about mutual knowledge rather beautifully as different from the traditional canons of knowledge, because you can't necessarily write mutual knowledge down, but you know it's there. You know when it's in the room. But mutual knowledge is a real threat to particularly architects. Less to urban designers, I would argue, but particularly to architects. Its first threat is that mutual knowledge, because mutual knowledge arises in discussion with other people, introduces others into the discussion. And others are really annoying, often, because they say things you don't want to hear. They go against your codes, your rules, your preconceptions, your standardized versions of knowledge. Sometimes you try to adapt your standardized versions of knowledge to that of others, but in that you're always doing what I was talking about right at the beginning. The adaptation is very partial, that you are in some way predetermining the situation and then only marginally adjusting it. But others are various. They may be users. For architects, users are generally incredibly annoying people because they come in and disturb the perfection. And because you can't control them. So very simply, that is why architecture culture is perpetuated through monographs of empty buildings in which the pictures are taken at the moment of completion before others have come in to assert their own identity. And people say that's ridiculous, and lots of pictures of buildings with people in, but by far the most, I would say pernicious, but let's just say promiscuous vehicle for architectural culture now is design. So if you just go onto design, in which there are 1 million hits a week, and which architecture students of all nationalities use as a source of architectural culture, just go and look and see how buildings there are portrayed. And the other is not ever design. Do you not use design in Italy? Are you so innocent? Do people use design? Yep. Yeah. So that is the first thread. And within the sort of great kind of sense of the history of architectural culture and architectural values and of this figure, if you put him against this figure, who is Nabo Hamdi, who is one of the kind of key figures in the history of participatory architecture, just those two pictures, I think, sort of tell a story. And of course, when you start to talk about others, you also need to start to adjust your methods of visualization, your methods of communication, your language systems. Because others don't understand notions of thresholds, negative space, positive space, public space. They don't understand these words. These are codes which are just generated in rooms like this. But others, when they come into it, think we are all mad people because we speak a different language. The second threat of mutual knowledge is what happens is that people bring in their own taste. This is terrible. This is a terrible kind of, the holy church of architecture is defiled by other people's taste. And so, of course, it ends up, taste, I think, we never talk about taste in architecture schools, but we should talk about it the whole time, because it is the most, I think it's our Achilles heel. because we know that there are systems of taste within architecture schools. We absolutely know it, but they're always unspoken. And in being unspoken, they're allowed to get even stronger because they're never criticised. So, in every single architecture school, there will be a different system of taste, but it is there with us the whole time. But we never talk about it. If, however, we talk about notions of mutual knowledge, if, however, we talk about notions of the other, and they bring their value systems, in particular their value systems of taste into the room, it's deeply upsetting. I have to say it's the most challenging thing of all. But we need to do it at every scale. Because when it does happen, in the radical participatory projects, this is what happens. These buildings really challenge all our perceptions of what constitutes good architecture. Because others have been involved within their production. So I think that one has to, this is rubbish. The Bauhaus work is real rubbish. But we need to look ourselves in the eyes and say, when we are talking about co-production, when we are talking about rules, when we're talking about codes, can we also talk about taste? Taste at every level, not just at the level of, is that a nice doorway, but taste at the level of what might constitute a public space within a city. The third threat that others, with their mutual knowledge, bring to the table is time. Because they bring their own stories, they bring their own lives, they bring their own projections of what might happen in the future. And in doing that, they introduce time into architecture in the city. Now, obviously, time is with us in architecture in the city, but I think there is a good argument to make, maybe an extreme one, but it's a good one, which I make, therefore I think it's good, obviously, that architects live in the terror of time. Architects do everything to deny time in order to fix their buildings at this moment of perfection. And as soon as time moves in, that perfection is unravelled. And therefore, what constitutes the value system of architecture is unravelled as well. I'll just give one example of this, which is in the book. When Sarah Wigglesworth and I, our first ever venture into publishing, was called Architecture in the Everyday. It was a very early, it's not that profound and quite naive because it was the first thing we ever wrote, exploration of how the everyday might be discussed within architecture. And what we wanted on the front cover was this image. It was architectural design. And we had an incredible argument with the publishers about the use of this image. We had permission for it, we're paid for it, on the front cover. And at one stage I accused them of being racist because it was a picture of two black people. That was a mistake on my part because once I'd accused them of being racist, then they took the moral high ground. But what transpired is that in the whole history of architectural design, since, I think, 1975, there had not been a single person on the front cover of architectural design. And that's because these people represent the projection of time. They represent the potential for change. Our triumph is that this is the cover. I think this is actually in a way better, because what I really like about this is there is a sense of the passage that people have moved through this picture. The bike has been left, the window has been opened, the door, etc., etc. So in a way I prefer this, but we were very struck, Sarah and I, that the argument we had about the use of these images in relation to the front cover of architectural design. And I still think that, although it was unsaid, it was to do with the depiction of time within an architectural icon, like the front cover of architectural design. The next threat that mutual knowledge and others bring is that of politics. We find politics very difficult to talk about because we misunderstand politics, because we confuse the politics of the everyday, i.e. of who the new mayor of Torino is, or what's going to happen in the referendum when my fellow citizens are going to take us out of Europe, God help us. We confuse the politics of the everyday with the politics of space. We don't like to talk about the politics of the everyday as architects because we don't think it's necessarily our business. I think it is, but I can understand why we don't want to talk about that. But that is then confused with an anxiety about talking about the politics of space and about the way that space is inherently political, that space sets up human relations which are by their very nature political relations. Look at this room, look at me, you're all looking at me, I am a professor, I am in a position of power. What I say must be true because all these adoring eyes are looking at me with no sense of challenge or criticism. A few of you are, but I won't point at you. But that sense of whereas if I was sitting here, or we're all sitting in a circle, then possibly this lecture would have a different power relationship. It's what we do at St Martin's in our spatial practice lecture series, is everyone's in a great big circle. And it works brilliantly in terms of the dissolving of kind of the power of knowledge being dispersed in a monothematic manner. Anyway, that is a threat which we don't often engage with. I think more people do, so I am characterising. And the final threat is this one. And this one I think is particularly relevant to the discussion here. Because when others and mutual knowledge are brought into the equation, then what is brought in is a potential loss of control. And professions define themselves through the ability to control. If we weren't able to control, then why would anyone employ us? So the argument would go. And yet mutual knowledge challenges that sense of professional control. And the control over the great mess of life out there in the city. And one of my favourite pictures of all time is this one, which I put in the book. This is from Edmund Bacon's book on the design of cities, in which every chapter has the word order in it. The order of the street, the order of the square, the order of the city. And this is my favourite image from it, in which we have one of Piranesi's Veduta di Roma on the top, and we have Edmund Bacon on the bottom. On the top, we have lovers kissing on a step. We have weather. We have a building which is disrupted by vegetation. We have a road you can hardly walk down because it's just a mess. It's just what happens within cities. And it's too difficult to tolerate because you cannot control it. And you can almost hear the kind of relief when he does this drawing, when suddenly he is back in control. And all those contingencies, all those lovers, all those strange plants, the mess of everyday life is eradicated through systems of order and control, in which suddenly you feel that you have grasped the city through a set of urban codes. So the question really is how does, and my argument is that this will come back to haunt you. In fact, the more that you try to eradicate it, the more it will disturb you. The more that you try to control the contingencies, the more they will come back to disrupt your perfected, ordered systems. So deal with it. That is always with us. I'm not saying you can't do that. All of us draw diagrams. All of us need to some way to understand the complexity of what's going on there. But if you're not going backwards and forwards between these two identities, then you're not actually engaging with the city. So the overall threat, just to sell another book, is architect's dependency, i.e. that architecture of the city depends. So for those of you who haven't read it, here is the book in 2 minutes. Architecture depends, or the city, but let's just talk about architecture because that's what the book's on all these things. This is not a difficult argument. This is a completely obvious argument. But when you put all these things onto a page like that, you get overwhelmed, and therefore you have to hold up the holy cross of architecture to just disperse all these dependencies. And we stand and we talk about architecture with its capital A and things like this, but eventually these will come back to disperse that holy body. That's the book. So the book is basically saying, deal with it. And it's not to say that one shouldn't in some way have a projective, an ambitious and optimistic sense of transformation. It's absolutely not to say that. But it is to say that those projections and transformations and optimisms always have to be placed against the realities, politics, multiple voices of the real world. And if you do that, then what my argument is that actually what have been threats become opportunities. And that these don't become things which in some way overwhelm the perfected body of architecture, but are agents which you use productively to reinvent what architecture and the urban scene might be. And so just to go quickly through these, in my last 13 minutes, the first opportunity is to move from the condition of problems. I don't like the idea that we are simply here to solve problems. Problems are miserable things. If you solve a problem, all you're doing is making the world a slightly better place. And equally, remembering Bannon's argument that problems are often invented by the professional. The problem of traffic flow in the city is invented by traffic engineers in order that they can solve it. It's called the destruction of many modern cities. And there's a very, we got Ezio Manzini as a professor at St. Martin's at the moment. And Ezio talks very beautifully about this, that he uses the example of older people. Older people are normally seen by healthcare professionals, by disabled architects dealing with access, by lots of people, as people who have problems. They have problems with mobility, they have problems with their health. What happens, as Ezio says, if you just see older people as people with capacity? They've got tons of capacity. They got inbuilt knowledge, they've got time. how do we use that capacity? So why do we see older people simply in terms of problems, which is an instrumental view of the world, as opposed to seeing older people as people with capacity? How do you make sense of the condition rather than seeing the condition as a set of multiple problems which rules or codes can solve? An example of that, and it's a very dangerous example, and some of you I know are dealing with the informal, is to look at the informal. The informal, in many ways, and I'm not romanticising poverty, I don't want to say the favelas are fantastic places, but one of the things that favelas, this is in Belo Horizonte in Brazil, are very brilliant at is the negotiation space, of being able to make sense of these challenges that they're facing. And there's a very interesting example, which is Belo Horizonte, which is the President Lula, 6 years ago, was going to come to Belo Horizonte. He was going to drive down a road which came in front of the favela. And the mayor of Belo Horizonte saw the favela as a problem. And therefore the solution was to get an architect in, an expert, who did this. So the president could drive past these rather than this, and it could be seen as a solution to the problem of the favela. In fact, it was a complete disaster. In the favela, there is an incredible understanding, vernacular understanding, of environmental conditions, of living inside and outside, of using materials, of sharing space, of negotiating space, of a family using one space in the morning for cooking in and another in the afternoon for childcare. These things were environmentally disastrous. They had no negotiated space. Everything was divided up, but they solved a problem. They didn't make sense. So I just think the sense of sense-making is more of an opportunity. The second is to shift the second threat, which is essentially a threat to our aesthetic value system and the privileging of our aesthetic value system, and not to talk about architecture or cities as objects of fact. This is a quote from Bruno Latour, but as objects of concern. As objects of fact, we as professionals can deal with them in terms of rules and codes and ways in which we evaluate them. As objects of fact, we can talk about them also in terms of aesthetics. As objects of concern, we can't. If we take the concern as a concern in relation to a societal concern or a human concern. I think the next pairing is the most difficult of all for any designer to deal with, which is to accept the inevitability of time. Of course time comes, of course change comes, of course we live in a world in which there is uncertainty, things are unpredictable. Of course all of that is true. How, as designers, do we accommodate that? How do we design effectively for the unfinished? If the whole of our culture is portrayed and privileged through the notion of the finished object, how could we shift a sensibility of finality, which is how architectural culture in particular is defined, into one of openness and the unfinished? How do we design for the unfinished? How do we talk about the unfinished? How do we allow the unfinished? Now, I have to say, I think it's incredibly difficult, particularly in architecture school, because if a student comes along and says, I've designed the unfinished, how do you talk about it? How do you know if it's good unfinished or bad unfinished? And I think that there's a real, I know Tatiana and I tried to do it 2 years running. It was the most difficult studio that we've ever done, which was to design for the unfinished. But I think it's something that, although maybe that sounds too kind of binary, the finished versus the unfinished, the design for change to be able to happen is, I think, a really crucial challenge that we have to face. And it is wonderful, I think, that Alejandro Aravena has been awarded the Christopher Prize, because those projects, they've been shown everywhere, I know, but I still think they're brilliant. The projects in Chile of the unfinished houses, I think, is a brilliant piece of design. It's just as difficult as designing the perfect object, because as designing for the unfinished, you have to always be projecting yourself into the future. You always have to be designing in the sense of anticipation. You always have to, therefore, in a way, be thinking beyond yourself rather than for yourself. And that's what makes a difference. That's where mutual knowledge comes into it. Because you're anticipating not your life, which is what architects tend to do, and to define themselves through their objects, but you're anticipating someone else's life. And that is where mutual knowledge then becomes important. I'm going to go through these. These are examples from flexible housing. That's the famous one. A brilliant, I think really brilliant. I'm going to go through this, and I want to just get onto this last bit, because this seems to me to be the key point. If we talked about above the loss of control, and in that loss of control, a sense that we are no longer a professional, that a sense we are no longer worthy of calling ourselves an expert, then what can we replace that with? And the easy formulation is this: we are both expert citizens and citizen experts, and so is the person on the other side of the table. The citizen is expert, but they don't have the codes or the language or the professional validation to call themselves expert. But they're very expert. They know how to live a life. They know what it means to take the garbage out. They don't need an expert to tell them that. And therefore this sense of being both at the same time. I got into real trouble on the radio when I said what happens in architecture school is that students come in as humans and go out as architects. And I think it's just obvious, this. But just remember that. Because it seems one of those things that we tend to forget. This is the final bit, which is incredibly important. The binary between bottom up and top down is very problematic. In the ideological days of bottom up, particularly in the 70s, there was a sense that any expert intervention at all was a manipulation of power. That any expert knowledge was in some way immoral or dangerous. That only the voice of the people had any form of validity, authority, or morality. The expert was there only to translate the voice of the people into drawings which could then be turned into construction. This quote is really important though, because what Gillian Rose, who is a philosopher, is talking about is that in the very ideological systems of bottom-up, in which the expert is dissolved, then knowledge is dissolved as well. Which means that you just get the lowest common denominator. You get this absolutely base thing. Yeah, I like parks. Yes, everybody should be happy, or whatever. And in that, the architect is demoted, or the urban designer, or the expert. But the people do not rise to power, i.e. the people are not empowered. So the argument is that of the expert citizen expert, is that of course you should bring your knowledge to the table. Of course you, as architects and urban designers, have an incredible sense of spatial knowledge. I do believe that there is something which is quite particular that architectural urban design education does, which is to begin to develop a sense of a spatial intelligence and spatial judgment, which is an empowering sense as long as that knowledge is used in a manner which is mutual, i.e. not imposed, but one which collects the voices around the table in order that then the spatial knowledge in some way is a shared one. And therefore, it isn't about bottom-up or top-down. It's about this kind of sense of a mutual knowledge in which the spatial intelligence of the designer is brought with human intelligence of everyone else, and together they collaborate in order to make a better place. Thank you.
Shall we break or shall we feel the need of a coffee? Feel the need of more food for your thoughts? We're probably on the short breaks. Yes, sadly the
just because of the concentration.
Okay. We owe you a blank table.
It's probably good if the audience is
Okay, so we are in time. We take a quarter of an hour for a coffee. That's very interesting. If I had to, I will discuss afterwards, but it's incredibly, as we have been talking for years. I knew your books quite late. I have been making for a long time participatory design, struggling with all. Please.
okay.
We break down.
Okay, so I'll start then. So thank you very much for inviting me along here. The title has just slightly changed. I threw in the word design. So it's now Urban Coding, Design and Planning. And I think my talk probably overlaps almost not at all with Jeremy's, except perhaps for the occasional use of a colour here against the grey background, which it has in common, and of course the English language. And my talk is slightly abstract in certain ways, but I think it's an issue for discussion perhaps later as to how the abstract and the physical relates to the social and the architectural and different scales and time scales and so on. I was very grateful to Michael earlier for teeing up why coding might be of interest, so that I don't need to spend much time about that, just the one slide with some suggestions about why codes might be of interest, so don't need to dwell on that. Today, I suppose some of the things I'm interested in talking about are what kinds of urban coding are there, and how does coding relate to design and planning. And one of the things I found, of course, is that coding is there's a quite diverse array of interpretations. So although in a sense I'm invited here to talk about coding because I've done some research in it, you could argue, well, none of us is an expert in it, any more than you would say that you are an expert in planning in general or design in general, etc., when there's a whole world or universe of design out there and of planning and so on. The way I've split it up is I'm going to talk a little bit about different types of code, and then three broad sort of classes of codes that I've just kind of tried to bring together, which we could call morphographic, morphological, and morphogenetic. Not too precious about the actual terms, but just one way of thinking about those. And then towards the end, to talk about how these kinds of codes might relate to design and to planning. And although this is the proportion, I'll probably spend proportionately longer down here. I suppose these slides will be made available for people later. Yeah. So, so some of the slides I might go quite quickly through, but I've got a set of references at the end, so that if anyone happens to be interested, they can follow up in more detail later. But there's quite a large number of slides, so I'll go through some of them quite quickly. I have also added in just a note for doctoral researchers, because I believe that there are a few here, of course. I was just reflecting this after some discussions we had actually yesterday. But basically, some of this material is, you could say it's well established or it's published, settled in some extent. And as Jeremy was saying earlier, because we're invited here, we have some kind of responsibility to pass on information that, in some sense, is, established, maybe even shared, that we can recognise. But also, some of it is I kind of revisited and developed recently, largely in preparation for this talk as well. Because again, as a speaker, we also somehow have a responsibility to bring in something maybe new, as well as just reproducing already established factual information. And also for doctoral researchers, I guess, is to remind us it also includes some unfinished ideas, given new life in a sense, perhaps given new life, that could do with further testing and development. So I actually came across a few slides from something I'd been working on before that I never actually got around to developing or publishing. And as I say, this is all part of research. You maybe leave things to the side and come back to them, work on them further later down the line. So this is part of the ongoing unfinished business of research, if you like. So I suppose because once upon a time I was writing a book about urban coding, it became called Urban Coding and Planning, I was drawn to asking myself, well, what is a code? And in fact, this part of it is rather abstract in some ways and exploratory in some ways, and in fact I didn't end up putting this kind of stuff in the book, but it serves as a way of thinking about different types of codes. You don't need to worry about what it says there, because I'm just about to go through it in more detail, but that's a kind of summary slide of just thinking through kind of like from first principles about what different kinds of code are. So a code could be, let's say, a short description, a concise descriptive specification of something. So for hydrogen we use the symbol H, and we can indicate sulfuric acid by a couple of H's, an S, and some O's, and of course we can condense that down to a chemical formula of some sort. It's a concise way of expressing information. Also, it could be a representation for transmission in another medium, and we see a kind of, from quick visual research, Robert Hooke apparently devised a system which is kind of based on alphabetical symbols that were used, and this is a 6-shutter system for transmitting messages over distances. So this could be some sort of code, and this is the code that the previous one, this ends up as this, and I guess we can think of semaphore codes and all sorts of kinds of codes of this type, different kinds of representation, and of course things like binary codes, bar codes, and so on. Note that a code isn't necessarily a concise description. That's to say, a binary number will tend to be longer than its decimal equivalent, but yet, at least in terms of the length of the string of numbers, although it only uses the 2 digits, of course. Possibly even for a code could be some kind of form of encryption, so a secret code and so on, or we could have some people who maybe write in mirror writing, so that to conceal, or for whatever reason. I found there's a generator online. There's an online Leonardo-like mirror writing generator. You can type in a word online and it will write it in mirror writing for you. A code could also be maybe a set of rules and regulations, conventions, instructions, maybe an ethical code for architects and planners and engineers. A kind of rule system. A code could be a system of generic components and the relationships between the components as well. So this is an old-fashioned kind of precursor to Lego, I suppose, of rubber bricks, basically, and sort of implicit in the definition of the element of the brick is the connecting plugs that allow you to plug those into each other. So implicitly, the elements have the built-in relationships implied. Now, this kind of set could be considered some kind of a sort of coding of some sort, and you can use this as a kind of kit of parts to design a finite design of a particular, let's say, architectural style. But we could use the same elements, of course, to have a completely different kind of design, of course, and perhaps even a different kind of style, insofar as it's possible to discern style in a kit of bricks. If we start with a brick, right, you end up with a bricks-type solution to your problem. A code, when we talk about computer codes or computer programs, so code could be associated with a program or an algorithm, a set of instructions or sequential operations. We talk of genetic codes as well, where we have a kind of set of components or a sequence of steps that can be used to specify something like, in a sense, specify the structure of an organism, for example, as opposed to a blueprint. So, I mean, the terms code and blueprint are themselves, I suppose, metaphorical, but the idea that, I mean, sometimes people talk about genetic blueprints, but as far as geneticists tell us, it's more like a code or a recipe or a program, the instructions for creating, for example, a human body, rather than it being a small, like a blueprint of a homunculus, if you like. And you can have a crossover between computer code and genetic codes, such as Richard Dawkins, who experimented with these so-called biomorphs, structures created by different kinds of genes. So there's your basic tree, and if you alter a particular so-called gene, you get a different kind of structure arising. And maybe another example would be fractals, or in this case, the kind of Levy curve, which you start with a single line here, you put a kink in it, then you take the next line, well, each line, you then put a kink in that, and you get this kind of staple shape, and then this becomes this, and if you keep iterating this, eventually you'll get that. So, in a sense, by this rule set here, you're kind of generating you can generate whole elaborate structures, and there are various other kinds of structures with emergent effects that can arise. Also, I suppose we could talk about instruction sets for building stuff, like in your own home perhaps, going to somewhere like IKEA or something. You have, the thing is being designed already, but you put the bits together, and there are instructions about how to put those bits together. I think this is a slightly lyrical interpretation. Or you could have the sort of design of a paper airplane, or is this a kind of instruction set for how you would create a paper airplane? A series of sequential steps, series of instructions that tell you how to take the raw material, a piece of paper, and end up with the hopefully flying machine. So those are just some examples, not particularly from the built environment, but an initial sort of brainstorm of what different types of codes there are. And I try to then maybe structure this in a bit more detail. So the various elements could include the elements themselves, the elements in the relationships, or the elements in the steps of generation. Could be different degrees by which something could be coded. So briefly, you could have a set of elements A, B, C, but if you didn't have any sort of code, they could just be put together in some jumbled, perhaps disordered manner, dare we say. Whereas if we introduce a set of relationships that relate the elements to each other, we can then start to create a sense of order. That could generate a series of different outcomes. So it doesn't just end up in one particular outcome, but you get a series of outcomes. And we could also then add in a particular series of steps of generation. Would be an extra dimension. So we say that step 1 you put in a block, step 2, step 3, and so on, and eventually you create an arch. So here the relationships are not generic, but specific to what is carried out in each step of generation. So basically you could get one of these by simply a set of instructions to create it, even if you're not specifying the whole object in one go, as it were. And so on, and we could put all of these things together and have some system where we have the elements and the relationships and the steps of generation all together. So that was just a quick run through a way of thinking about what a code could be and its relationship to creation of order. Okay, so the first of the three main types I'm going to talk about now, broadly called morphographic codes, and I'll just go through these quite quickly. As I say, if you're interested, you can follow up the references in more detail. But by this, what I mean is something like a coded representation of a specific form, whether that is existing or proposed form. It doesn't necessarily imply that it represents every detail of the content or the structure. For example, the chemical formula H2SO4 doesn't of itself tell you how the atoms are arranged in molecules, but it captures some key element of in this case, this description. So morphographic codes, I'm referring to codes that describe stuff. And examples here, just up front, Lionel March's binary codes, Philip Stedman's various kinds of codes, and then some that I published in the last 2 years. So Lionel March then had, back in 1976, the Boolean description of a class of built forms, where he made a kind of concise description of this kind of built form in, if you can see, each dividing this building into different cubes of space and coding them with binary digits and getting long strings of binary digits to try and codify something about the shape or the form of the building. And his colleague, Philip Stedman, who's now my colleague at the Bartlett, he then took some of these ideas further, the idea of the archetypal building, and there's a paper of that name, which I think I've written somewhere, where, without going into all the details, he codes up different aspects of a building, which is this is the exterior of the building, this is a courtyard, these are the rooms facing the courtyard, and this is a corridor. The darker line is the corridor. And so basically, you can imagine you can apply binary digits as to whether this slice of the building exists or not. And so that if you have a building like this, which is actually labeled C here, this building here, this can be broken down and represented by this code here. So you could have a code that specifies something about the configuration of a building. It's simply describing the building, I suppose, and it's describing a simplified aspect of the building, it should be said. And he wrote a book very recently about building types and building forms, where he goes into much more detail, longer codes and different kinds of building types. Also, he developed outside, you can also apply it to the outside of buildings and the streets outside, and whether there's space around the building and so on. And we ended up, actually the two of us ended up writing a sort of conference paper on it, where we looked at the archetype of street cross-section, and you could binary coding to that as well. So that's another kind of coding, I suppose. So in the preceding cases, present elements within a pre-specified framework. So to understand the code, you need to know what the cells in are implied. As I say, a code like H2SO4 doesn't of itself tell us how the bits fit together. And as I say, the archetypal binary code requires knowledge of the archetypal building or layout. I just said that. So you could take it a level further and actually represent more detail, the structure of relationships through a more graphical code. And then I mean, this was a prelude to some work I was doing. I was trying to find a way of encoding or thinking about the structure of the urban fabric, the sort of morphological structure of streets, plots, and buildings. So this is, I'm just going to rewind a little into the purpose of this was, the idea that could we mathematize in some way the environment. So, the book of nature written in the language of mathematics. So maybe the built environment could also be expressed in mathematical form. So that was, I suppose, part of the inspiration. You could say that a town plan of itself is a work of geometry. In other words, it's not just a geographical item, but you could say it's an abstraction that can be analysed in geometric terms. And one of the ideas here was that, by coding things in a particular way, it could, in principle, help to bridge some of the barriers we have between different traditions, different languages, and different approaches to morphology, such as between Kinigia and Konzen and so on. Calavieri Murat and Teke de Jong were also others whose work was partly inspirational towards this. I won't go into these details, but Teke de Jong sort of invented a kind of system of formulas for describing various urban operations at different scales. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I just developed, it's quite simple really, a system of labeling different kinds of urban elements as recorded on the plan in a way that allows you to express relationships between the elements using a kind of symbolic notation, which is abstracting something from the ground plan. As I say, that there's references there if anyone's interested, and this became what I called an area structure representation. So if you take an area like this, it's not just a series of 10 rectangles, but there's actually a structure to it that we intuitively understand, and you can give it a formula. So I sort of experimented with a series of different ways of using alphanumeric formulae to represent different kinds of urban fabric, and I won't go into all the details about how these were contrived, but as I say, there's this paper here, which came out last year, explains that in more detail. But you could represent different kinds of morphological fabric according to different. So this is the same morphology. This is the same urban fabric. The reality on the ground is the same, but morphologists of different kinds will abstract different kinds of information. So the one A3 has just looks at the streets and with 3 levels of hierarchy, or you could look at the plots with 3 or 2 levels of hierarchy, and you could look at buildings with different levels of morphological hierarchy and so on. So there are reasons for all these things, and you can get more and more complex if you like, cadastral formula, condensed formula, etc., etc. Lots of ways of codifying the urban fabric. And of course, the problem is, once you get into it, you start to generate very long formulas, which are in practice probably unlikely to be used because they're just too unwieldy. However, I don't expect many people will be trying to compute this particular operation. However, there may be some aspects of using codes or this kind of codification in typological exercises, in this case, plot series that could be defined in certain ways in a trying to do it in a systematic manner, where the code here can help to pinpoint something of significance about the morphological structure. And there's one more there about different kinds of urban blocks, each of which has a particular formula according to this kind of equation. Anyway, so in these preceding cases, it's included implicit or explicit relationship, representation of the relationships. But here we now move on to more explicit use of the specification of relationships towards the generation of form. So the previous ones were mainly describing what's already there, or it could be describing a future form. But when I move into what I've called morphological codes, and you could say all of these are morphological to some extent, we move more into cases where we're more specifically thinking about the elements as building blocks for use in design of stuff, design of built environment. So what I'm calling a morphological code in this case is used in a general sense to refer to an ordered set of morphological elements and relationships that would typically imply or may imply allowable or necessary relationships between different parts of the built environment. And I suppose implicit in all this is the idea that, for example, there's a difference between a finite design up at the top, which you might call a work of architecture, and the sense of order, such as, which is kind of like what I was saying earlier about a kit of parts and their relationships. And this was, I can't remember the reference I took this originally from, but this was from the work of Glasgow architect Alexander Thompson, or known as Alexander Greek Thompson, because he had an admiration for designing Greek style and also Egyptian style, etc., buildings. So the idea is that you could have a sort of vocabulary of elements which could be seen as some kind of code where you can generate an order through the way these parts relate to each other and generate larger wholes, I suppose. When we get to the urban scale, we could talk about urban codes or urban design codes or design codes as a means of specifying allowable elements and relationships. So this was taken from the code that was generated after the Great Fire of London of 1666, where there was a series of street types were suggested, and each street type had maybe a building type associated with them, and the building type had various dimensions and materials, specifications, and so on. So that this was a way of sort of creating order among the new buildings that were generated. And I guess coding became sort of fashionable, newly fashionable, or renewed fashionability, especially in, I suppose, the Anglophone world, by the new urbanists in the United States, who have developed a whole new tradition of, I guess, form-based coding, the likes of Douani and Plato Zyber. And with this kind of urban code as a means of specifying potential order, in this case it's the town of Seaside in Florida. And in the context of this renewed interest in coding, I'd been doing research in something and got to talking to publisher who suggested, or we had a conversation that resulted in this book I referred to earlier called Urban Coding and Planning. And this is an edited book, and the reason I'm saying that is because it contains, each chapter was about a different part of the world, written by different people, so it's actually these other people, in this case the experts, in the coding traditions of their own respective countries. So it included coding traditions in USA, such as the Manhattan codes for setbacks. This was an Adelaide code for building facades. We had authors from Asia, India, China, and Japanese codes of various kinds. And the Spanish America traditions, including I guess the laws of the Indies, although there are slight different interpretations of these, and this was someone else's graphical or visualization of what the laws of the Indies meant. because, as I understand it, the laws of the Indies were written rules and were, I suppose, devised to be transmitted in the medium of writing to a continent far away. And what else? South Africa, where which kind of engages partly with the issue of informality, and also the idea of how you could use codes or coded handbooks as kind of manuals that would allow a participant development, because maybe people, especially I suppose in an illiterate context, people could maybe understand better drawings and explanations of how you could design and build stuff, where that information is codified in some way. So anyway, in the book I summarised, or attempted to summarise some of the stuff. So this is an example of a table here that draws together some of the lessons or the content arising from the preceding chapters. And basically what this was trying to say, in case you can see it, is these are different scales, from the settlement scale down through buildings, down to building components. With each of these we can have codes for different kinds of elements, we can have codes for different relationships between elements here. The next one is qualitative specifications, and the other final one is quantitative specifications. And each number is referring to a chapter which is referring to one of the traditions I mentioned before, whether it was Kyoto, South Africa, USA, China, India, etc. So this was a kind of summary mapping, I suppose, of how the codes involve different aspects of elements and their relationships. And and so, for example, and also the idea that these things interact in certain ways and they overlap and interact. So, for example, interlocking parts and wholes across scales. I think that comment was relating to, if you read Christopher Alexander's work and you read something like a pattern language, you get a strong sense that what he's trying to do there is to talk about the kind of interlock of the different elements at different scales, and how they, how an element isn't necessarily complete of itself. An element itself can be unfinished. But that element is made more complete by other elements that support it, and it helps to complete larger patterns and so on. So the point of that annotation was that, so this says, street layout type, building placement would be the building placement relative to the road, that is the positioning of the building relative to the road, relates both to the larger scale of the streets and to the building and to the lower scale of the building components. So, so the point is that one of the points is that codes can occur at different scales, and they can also relate between scales. And I'm just going to go very quickly through. I have a few examples of street-related codes, which I'll go through very quickly, because hopefully you've got the idea by now. But you could even see something like Le Corbusier's 7V system of roads as a kind of code. And you know it's a code because if you mess it around, you see that doesn't make any sense, or it doesn't make sense in terms of what the author was intending. But you could probably abstract a logic from that, which is a basic logic of things connecting upwards in the hierarchy. And you could call that code. Similarly, but that was a sort of modernist code for modernist road layouts. And in this book, Streets and Patterns, I tried to imagine I went through examples of how you could have a more street-based orientation. You could still have a code, and you could still have a structure and an order, but without necessarily going to Le Corbusier's freeways and conventional modernist road systems. But you could have a system of rules for traditional streets, and how the elements should connect up and so on. I won't go into all the details here, but you could have a systematic organisation of different kinds of streets and how the streets connect to each other, whether to do with different kinds of access or different kinds of speed and so on. And if you put all these streets together, you could end up with mixed patterns. So, like, you could have a mixed-use block that isn't generated by specifying there shall be a mixed-use block, but it's the result of having a series of streets of different kinds, and depending on how many kinds of streets you have, you can generate a vast diversity of possible solutions, I suppose. So anyway, I'll just skip through the next couple of slides, but this just sets out in more detail what a code, basically an urban code for streets could be, the different elements that could be present, and how those link up. So you would have relationships about types of routes, how the routes are allowed to connect up, how routes relate to land uses or frontages, how buildings relate to each other, and finally the third dimension, if you wish. Okay, and then the final kind, which I'm going to go again through quite quickly, is what we might call morphogenetic codes, where there's an element of, well, basically there's an element of sequence of creating something with the dimension of time. So we talked about a lost dimension earlier somewhere, and we also had the terror of time earlier. So we can also reintroduce time as a dimension here. So morphogenetic code, I would suggest, could be defined as something involving a set of instructions or actions for creating form, in this case. Hence implies the dimension of time. Time without the terror, hopefully. Especially if we're talking about at the urban scale, because I don't know about you, but do urbanists have a terror of time? So maybe if it's an urban code, that we reduce the terror of time, hopefully. And it could be synonymous with generative code. I mean, there's a whole issue to do with language, and we go through phases where there's a proliferation of terms in different languages as well, and sometimes these take a while for these terms to settle down. I don't mean these terms in any particularly precious way. So we could have something like some kind of logic, which could be a generative code, which could generate different kinds of configuration, which could then be manipulated to fit the necessity of the site. So these all have the same structure, but this structure is more curved, this is more rectilinear, this is a combination, etc., etc. So a code can be part of the generation of diversity. So I just want to bring that in. Of course, we know this in one part of our brain. We have, our brains have partial participation, perhaps. Like one part of our brain knows that codes can generate diversity, but another part of our brain, we're thinking codes restrict freedom. So, there's a mix of these things. I'm sure we'll end up talking about those. So in terms of morphogenetic stuff, we can think of a tree growing program, something that generates a branching tree, for example. But of course, a tree growing program could result in different kinds of patterns, some of which look like trees. Others, depending how the program runs, could end up looking more like grass in this case, or parsley. Or if you let the program run and go wild, it may end up being disordered and creating a grid. Eventually you fill out the whole space. So this actually relates to a simulation program I was involved with, where we simulated an urban grid, the growth of an urban grid. And so the idea is that behind this, the idea is that you would have rules of generation of the urban grid, where in this case you start with an outline of roads and some main roads, and then you build in, and this came kind of randomly. Well, the placement of individual roads was random, but the rules by which the roads connect to each other and subdivide the space are like a fixed code. So basically over various iterations in time, yellow represents the development, and more development adds in, and a kind of quasi-urban looking structure. So this is after 8,000 runs, emerges, and you get this kind of familiar kind of urban pattern that in some senses has order, because there's a built-in order to it, but it also has a kind of random element. The items are hardly repeating, except at maybe the smallest scale of individual cells or individual grids and so on. And what we found quite interestingly was emergent effects would arise. So we kind of find the equivalent of sort of like main streets with a sort of local high street spine, you would call it, with slightly denser development along here. And this just emerges out of the way the roads interact with the roads and routes interact with each other. We didn't program into it that every half kilometre or whatever there shall be a high street spine. These just emerged out of kind of the randomisation process. So there's a sort of probabilistic element there as well. Okay, so the last section, which will be the longer than the other sections, because there should be a little bit time to spend a bit more time per slide, is so what I've been talking about up to now is interpreting different kinds of codes, including street codes, urban codes, some architectural details as well, codes at different scales. But how does this relate to design and planning, which is ultimately where this discussion was aiming to get to? And there was a kind of sense in which somehow these three things are somehow connected, design, planning, and there's this other thing called coding. And some of the times coding seems to be part, a code can be part of a plan, a code sometimes could be synonymous with a plan, a code could be part of a design maybe, it's one object and we're just seeing different aspects of it, or how do these things all relate to each other? I suppose one of the things I was coming at it from, I had this kind of, and this is where you bring in the subjective aspect of research, I suppose. I kind of had this idea that maybe coding isn't just a subordinate part of planning or of design, but maybe code is its own kind of thing. And maybe it is as like planning and design as they are each other, and as distinct from planning and design as design and planning are from each other, if you see what I mean. Anyway, so actually before I get on to that, I also have another couple of slides here which talk about the element of scale. So this was a period when I was trying to think through relationships between different kinds of codes and different kinds of designs and master plans. And along here is the scale of intervention, and up here is the scale of intention. So the idea here is that, you could design a whole object, like a bottle, for example, where the intention is at the scale of the bottle and the intervention is at the scale of the bottle. You could go right up to settlement and similarly, but the idea is that, for example, you could have a code where you're intending to, the scale of intention is at the larger scale. You're trying to write a code for a whole town to express something about a whole town or a whole neighbourhood, but the actual intervention would be at the scale of buildings or building components. So you could be expressing that every building should have a certain setback or a certain material or a certain kind of doorway or something. So you could be working with interventions that are at the scale of building components, the scale less than a whole building, but your intention is for a whole district or neighbourhood or even a whole settlement. And using the same logic as this diagram, a kind of summary, if you look at the world in that particular way, you could say that codes could be seen as being up here. A master plan or an outline design could be on this diagonal axis, where the scale of intervention equals the scale of intention, and then you could get something like what you might call a total design or blueprint, where you design everything. Like if you design a whole town in all its detail, this would be this case here, then basically you're intervening right from the macro structure of the outline of the settlement and the whole superstructure of main roads and so on, right down to every detail at the architectural scale, which is different from a sort of outline settlement plan or land use plan, which might only deal with the outline design, but you leave the rest to other people. Okay, so the other thing I tried to look into was, well, if you're going to try and nail down or try and capture what is the relationship between coding, design and planning, we might need to have some kind of definition. And of course this becomes difficult because the world is full of different stuff out there, and of course different countries and different languages mean different things. You know, a plan in one country could be a code in another one, and so on and so on. But I was trying to, I suppose, distill it down to some basics at a reasonable degree of simplicity and so on, because not ultimately writing a legal document in this case. So the idea would be that to design implies conceiving a whole thing or a finished thing, in advance of construction. Of course you can disagree, but this suited my purposes. Whereas planning implies to organise stuff, people or things or events in space and time. And this partly goes back to Peter Hall's definition in, I think it was Urban and Regional Planning, written originally in, I think, 1972 or 73, where he in fact said there are two different meanings of plan. One is a plan to do something, like a plan to go to New York, and the other is a plan as in a two-dimensional representation of something. And those are two quite distinct meanings. But they could both be captured at this level in this definition, to organise stuff in space and time. But if you then come to say, well, what is a design? You could say a design is a representation, or I think I'd probably move towards saying a specification might be a better word. Specification of a whole final form in advance of construction, meaning a design implies you've thought it through before you start building it. It's not the only way of creating stuff, of course. You can make stuff by putting one brick on top of another. That's not to deny any of that as a possible way of creating stuff. So our town design is then a specification or representation of the whole final form in advance of construction. In other words, if you say town design, which is of course the name of the book by Frederick Gibbard in the 1960s, like if you're using the words systematically, then town design would imply you're designing a whole object, a town, which I think is distinct from urban design, I think, where urban design, I think, is not necessarily specifying a single whole, finite, self-contained product. So this could take the form of a plan, that word again, but it could also be a cross-section or some other kind of representation. Now, if we come on to plan, as I say, the two senses of plan that Peter Hall mentioned back in the early 70s, one could be described as an approach or a set of actions to achieve the fulfillment of some objective, or secondly, it could be the representation of the targeted final form, or it could be of an existing form. Hence, a town plan is etc. An approach to create or regenerate a town, or a town plan could be the ground level representation of the targeted final town, or it could be of an existing town. Although I'm not going to talk much more about existing towns, but just to remember, of course, that we could be talking about, a town that exists or a historic town could be specified in the form of a plan and so on. So if we use these definitions just for the sake of the present argument, then we can see that at some point there's an overlap between town design and town plan. If you have a planar representation of the future forms of town, in other words, the design in the form of a plan, it becomes, the words design and plan could be interchangeable, which is just represented as another one of those sort of conundrums. But then we bring in code. So how does coding fit into this? And in fact, thinking about it and just experimentally, I came up with, and thinking through from the previous slides, several. I'm not saying these are the only four, but certainly was able to reasonably, in short time, generate 3 or 4 possible definitions of different kinds of codes. Some of which are just representing elements, or it could be the final form, it could be elements and relationships, or it could be a generative specification which implies something, gives rise to something. So if come back to London 1667, So the idea you could have a code could be an alternative to a plan. So this was Wren's plan, I think. There were 2 or 3 other ones. I think Robert Hooke and Evelyn, I think, had plans for rebuilding London after the fire. So that you could call that a design, or a sort of plan. Or you had this, which is an urban code. And you could say, well, I just said that. So this code could be interpreted as a tool for ordering, but without a plan or a finite design. Although, historically, what actually happened was, well, they didn't build this. They generally built the buildings on the original street pattern. They built some new streets and widened streets as well. But in a sense, there was an actual existing street plan or pattern which acted as a sort of template. So these didn't just happen in isolation, but were also guided by sort of the ghost of the previous city of London. Similarly, or you could more formally integrate the planning and the coding. So, for example, the seaside that I mentioned before had a plan, sort of outline plan layout, and this is the code. It was not very clear here, where the plan and the code were designed to work together, or they were devised to work together. And actually, if we put this all together, if you can see the writing here, so we can bring in codes up here, and in fact, those definitions, the 4 definitions of codes, can be fitted into the Venn diagram like so that we can, if we choose to, we can find places and examples of different kinds of things where these definitions intermingle, and we can find examples where a design could be a plan, or a code could be a design, a code could be a plan, and so on. Well, this is all just playing with words, of course, but we could try and find examples, and here's the the Wren plan here. We have maybe some finite whole designs here. We could have a coded version of a design. We could have codes up there. The codes at the top are just the elements and the relationships. They don't specify a particular finite form. Here we have a kind of these are the more kind of morphogenic ones here. You can think about these things and maybe shuffle things around or think of other examples or your own examples, etc. And so when thinking about this, some conclusions then from this was, from this point of view, a code is as like or as distinct from a design or plan as design and plan are distinct from each other. So if you look at the world in that way, you could say that code is as equally foundational, fundamental aspect of some aspect of the specification form, and code isn't simply a subordinate part of a design or plan. Hence the significance of the code as a potential partner of or alternative to design and or planning. But also, I was just reflecting on this quite recently, actually. If you look at this Venn diagram, it's systematic, but in some senses it masks certain irregularities and idiosyncrasies. For example, I think on reflection that the meanings of the word plan are sufficiently different that they could actually have less in common with each other, the 2 different meanings of plan, than they have with a design or a code. For example, like you could say that a ground plan, this kind of thing, is actually so different from these other kinds of plans that they may as well be, going off in a different dimension and so on. I mean, you could redefine. Similarly, a code of conduct might be a plan. If you think of a plan as a set of instructions or something, depending on how you define them, a code of conduct might lie outside. What I mean is, what I had originally there, meaning a design as a plan, it might actually be more useful to define plan as a set of intended actions and reserve a town plan as being a specification of a specific form, and put it within the blue circle there. Similarly, code of conduct could be shifted around. So in some senses, this is just shifting around words and meanings, but in some senses, it can help to clarify what these different things are, and certainly when we talk about planning, we could be talking about quite disparate things, and similarly also with coding. So in a sense, we've ended up even questioning the meaning of plan as well as just trying to pin down what a code is. Anyway, these ideas are all up for grabs in a sense. So the significance is the different kinds of code to be aware of and their potential role with or without designs or plans. So the idea that you could have maybe a more bottom-up system of design, we were talking about earlier, maybe generative codes that include the actions can give rise to either fixed form or many forms. Could be an alternative to a design or a master plan. A code can be as physically specific as a design or a master plan, or it doesn't need to be. A code could be as participatory as a system of planning. Again, because if we recognise the diversity of types of code and plan, we could make them more participatory if we wish. It's not just a matter of saying, well, a code is a fixed population, whereas a plan is more participatory, or vice versa. Just coming to the end here. I mean, I think one thing I thought about doing this, thinking of it in this way, is that if you say that a plan is a set of intended actions, basically then the yellow becomes, the area in here becomes, in a sense, those items that reflect the time dimension. So going back to the terror of time. So, and also we talk about lost dimensions. So there's an added dimension of time here. So you could have a three-dimensional object here, but if we also bring in time, it becomes a four-dimensional object, etc. Two-dimensional plan could become a two-dimensional space and one-dimensional time, etc., etc. And you could actually say, well, everything within the blue circle is specifying a finite product, and the other kinds of code and plan around here are ones that could specify an indefinite number of objects, not necessarily one single finite design. And finally, I remember, there are questions about who's involved in all of this. It could be that a planning authority or a community sets the codes and the relationships, or embeds the will of the communal in the codes and the plans, and the individual design could be something that is the design that is in the prerogative of the individual designer. Anyway, I think the diagram invites us to question how we do stuff. It's not intended as a rigid, it's not intended too rigidly. Okay, so some conclusions then. So I suggest that coding is distinct from planning and design, not just a subsidiary part of either. There are many interpretations of code, I've already said that. In other words, it doesn't just boil down to one thing. Codes can be classified according to a variety of criteria or dimensions. And also, I think the diagram before helps to illustrate how generative codes relate to other kinds of codes and designs and plans and so on. I think there's also a question about division of labour, whether it's new or not, is maybe open to question, between different kinds of professional, and not just professionals, but non-professionals as well. Like we're used to the idea of a planner and a designer, maybe an urban designer, an architect, a builder, maybe, and this is kind of like a piano keyboard, but you could have something in between a planner and a designer who's an urban code writer, and maybe a buildings designer could work with a code writer to create architecture. I don't know if that would be called architecture. That's for others to debate, I think. But there could be a role for someone working codes as distinct from a sort of conventional planner or conventional designer. And also, which goes back to some of the things at the very start, we're talking about some of the reasons we might be interested in this, the possibility for a kind of generative code to be alternative to a fixed master plan or design, where there is some kind of order built into the elements or the relationships, but there's also a flexibility because it can be generated incrementally and through time and by different people, can accommodate many hands and so on. And this was actually a quote from Elizabeth Plato-Zyberg, who suggests that codes could be part of a new kind of city making. It could be a co-production of city making, to go back to the title of this series. Okay, and more or less the final slide. So a final note for doctoral researchers, I suppose. So in preparing this talk, it's allowed me to reorganise my thoughts on the matter. I think the new material threw up some unanticipated results. I think the typologies of codes and definitions changed in the writing of the presentation. I also ended up questioning and even thinking of the need to redefine and re-question what planning actually was. So it wasn't just about codes, but what really planning means. Also, the new material, I suppose it's obvious. It's obvious in hindsight, right, that the new material makes the old material look old. Which means the limits of knowledge are ever shifting, which we know, because we're in the knowledge business, and research is never ending. So that's some conclusions for any researchers, I suppose. And I'm going to stop there. So thank you for your attention.
So, I think we are in time. Because the result of the institution is really time. On trains schedules. I think we can take away the plasma to get to sleep, and I turn it on the light. So, according to your idea, we should make a circle now. But I think we can also have a free conversation by keeping this form, or we can also use the idea, in fact, that we reduce it and go to the next room and have a round table discussion. But do you think that you can be active also in this formative room? Okay, we'll try. First, I want to thank the two of you for giving so different and both interesting and rich lecture. The fact of, for the PhD students, the fact that we bring together completely different approaches is of course part of the story. Architectural schools have a long tradition in building up consensus by inviting all the people you agree with and strengthening your position. And this happens in most of the colloquium and seminars we have also in this faculty. So the members of the community of restoration invite themselves to provide support to the basic things they have to do is to keep architects out of the restoration field. They speak to each other, and if they succeed in having somebody of the coding authority within the room, they can be also effective in that. One of the reasons why we didn't make the natural match between the four speakers, which was Simon and Jeremy and Alex and Stefan, so we could have a wonderful about agencies and change and participation, innovation, and one about rules and coding, was exactly that we wanted you first, not simply to have this TV format, opponent and challenger format, but because we want you to see how you build a solid discourse, which has nothing to do with truth. It's simply that I think more and more that what we have to transmit you is not content, is some craftsmanship in making up your position and building a solid discourse that can be tested in a conflictual, although politely conflictual relationship to the others. This is also why you will have noticed that with the new college and new professors in the College of Architecture, PhD, we're more and more shifting from critics on your content in your research to critics on the way you build. And how do you learn to build? I think that one good way is seeing how others do build their things, and the best way is seeing different ways of construction compared. So this inner contradiction is a goal of this seminar. And of course, there is no good and bad character in the story. So it is simply to let them expose also the kitchen. And I think, especially Stephen, in the last part, but also in the other two sessions, the other lectures, there was this idea that as you prepare you'll also challenge the materials you've been working with. This is made in front of you, and I think that could help a lot. There is one linking point between the two lectures, apart being good, of course, which is, I think, is about legitimacy and how you are legitimate in the talking to the others. So both Jeremy and Stefan were somehow describing possible alternative, of course, very different paths to the big problem that you have when you step away from the single client, single designer mode, which of course I charge Stephen, I charge Jeremy of building my house, and within some set of rules, this dialogue turns out to be satisfactory, hopefully, for both, which is not usual also, even when the relationship is that simple. We are discussing how architecture can happen at a urban scale, in a pluralistic setting, when we recognize that others have a say in that. There is, of course, a third missing character in this set, which is, but we don't need even to talk about it, but just to complete the picture, it made a short comparison in the presentation of Jeremy, and it's, of course, the Zaha Hadid speech about what is architecture, which is, of course, is about being a master that holds the power and through forms control what the result is. So in that case, legitimacy is purely based on the authority of the one who produces the form. Jeremy said enough to debunk the story and to undermine the ethics that sometimes are covered by this kind of authoritative design. So when we talk to the others, of course, time comes in, politics and need comes in, and the issue of control comes in. But this is just to show you not only the opposition, but also the linking point, which is about the legitimacy of our work and how it happens in the urban space. I will try to break the ice with two questions, one to Jeremy and one to Stefan. Jeremy has made a very clear and linear speech that was, especially as you might know in my experience, the personal experience and professional practice, there's been a lot of participatory design, so I felt particularly engaged by his speech, as well as urban coding was also part of what I do. So the same was for you, but when it comes to ethic, of course, it is more personal than when it comes to techniques in coding. So what I would like to ask Jeremy is, your speech was built like on a line, in which on one extreme of the line we had the ladder of participation, which has been, I met many times in my discussions, academics and not, about participation. And at the end, there was the turning the threats into opportunities, or was something like that, which you were saying, so reversing the code. And my question to Jeremy is, I have the impression that, in fact, you could twist the answer, and your lecture becomes like this. So if we go the next step after asking, so, okay, how shall we turn the threats into opportunities? We might re-begin again with the ladder of participation, because if we make one step forward and want to understand how this interaction with the others happen, hopefully we do not land into Tony Gibson's planning for real, which is, of course, is a good scapegoat for any critical participatory design. You must also be aware that was conceived in 1956, and the issue was having a rough and fast way of interaction in reconstruction programs in the UK. So there is an historic setting. But I think that we have a question of aware of all the possible difficulties, contradiction of participation and interaction. How do we design tools that allow the conversation that you seem to desire? And also, is that you have been, the one critic I could make to your speech is that maybe you have been squeezing co-production and participation in a whole bunch, while in my opinion there is a very slight difference participation traditions having a long history of waving hands and say, are you for the park or are you for the highway? We are all for the park. This is the idea of the all participation debate has that we are healing democracy, so democracy doesn't work anymore because the mayor has to judge whether it's better for the city, park, or highway. We as the citizen, and we come out as kind of supplement of democracy. I think co-production is completely different because we're not asking anybody to raise a hand, but to become active part in making things, which is much more complex, although shares the same ideological biases. Put at risk participation along the ladder. So this is a bit my question. So how do we get the conversation? For Stephen, I also started from this legitimacy issue. We have to accept the fact that coding is intimately conflictual. I mean, when we go to codes which are not town planning codes, on which there is relatively low conflict, but whatever is, for instance, civic codes or codes of construction of norms that have economic relevant interest, we see how strong the lobbying is about coding and how the conflict is inherent to coding. So my question to coding is always, as long as you stay within the techniques of coding, everything works. But if you want to answer to the question of legitimacy, you might easily fall into Jeremy's field, saying, okay, who entitles you to code? Who is invited to the dialogue about code? How code is redistributing by organizing space? How is redistributing wealth, for instance? Or how it is redistributing accessibility? Your 7 Bs of Le Corbusier is a way of redistributing accessibility. The favela is organized in a completely different way, maybe somehow more egalitarian. And also my trust in codes is a bit undermined. I love coding, but it's undermined by the fact that taste, which Jeremy mentioned at a certain moment, is a highly corrosive element. Because the real issue in our pluralistic societies is how do we code your right not to stay within the code? So maybe we shall say this way. So the code is a kind of agreement, but the inherent fact of the city is that somebody might come in from another generation or from another part of the world or within our society who's not, and challenge the very heart of the codes. My question in your scheme is that you made a very good scheme of saying this is the planning, this is like here you have the builder, and you say, okay, we might need something here, we might need something here, but at least in my experience, a very painstaking position is here between the urban designer and the architect, because I can get a way of getting along with my planning friends, and I, as an architect, I usually try to get along with my builders, or try to. But what is really painstaking is this space in which you look at the building code and say, no, please, not the setback on this road, or why should I limit my overhang to 1.5 meters or things like that. So this is a very delicate issue. It was just to launch the story, and some other question I welcome, and I think that then you can wrap it up and try to give back, or it's not the answer. I think you can be here, and it's more near to the city. Or you don't want to get back on the point. So you can take your chair and turn it the other way around. I do the same configuration. Organization elements. Space. Yes. By the way, for ones who love coding, the thing we make is against the code of use of this room, which is ruled by the Monument Preservation Authority that says that chairs should not make run on the floors of this castle. So somebody else want to?
I will ask a question related to what Matteo was saying. You speak about selective participation, which is better than a full participation, which is not possible in a sense in any way that is. So I'm very interested in how can I appraise the selective participation? Do you have in mind any criteria to select to participate, or And related to that, more for Stephen maybe, what do you think about the possibility after a selection to have non-expert or expert citizen, as Jeremy called them, to participate in the elaboration of code directly, not only giving their advice about some solution, but actively proposing something for code? Non-expert that have been selected, and now Jeremy is explaining us how.
Maybe I'll start by answering the first question that I, of course, won't answer, which is how do you get conversation going? I'm referring to, and you use the word tools, and then we talk about codes. One of the things I'm really interested about codes or any system of design is, and this is to pick up something where Stephen's questioning his own work, is when it's the flip from using a system of analysis, which then becomes a system of projection. And I think that designers tend to do that. They analyze the world in the same way as they project the world. And codes are an absolute example of that. The problem with that is, which is why your final Venn diagram, I think, it works much better, yeah? Where you're saying planning is about projection rather than laying things out in order. The problem with using the same method to both analyze and project is that inevitably, in the act of analysis through codes, you are making editorial decisions. No code can possibly capture the entirety of the world, almost by definition. The code is therefore reductive. Therefore, if you use the same method of coding as analysis to then turn it around and become coding as projection, that act of projection will also be reductive. So the answer to your question is, how do you start a credible conversation? Is that we have to find new languages to talk about projection, to talk about the future, which are different from the languages by which we analyse what we already have. What that is I can answer. But the issue I have with the whole area of, and I think at the end of your lecture, Stephen, you were challenging yourself of taking a code from being something which is a way of seeing what is there already to a code as something which is projected and therefore is different from what is there.
Will I just follow on?
Yeah.
So I'll probably reflect on that, but coming back to the legitimacy issue, I mean, I think an important point sort of underlying, when you reflect on what I'm trying to get at, is in a sense, when looking back on it, is my talk was rather abstract. I was trying to collect together and categorize and analyze all the different kinds of codes that were involved, etc. And I wasn't talking very much at all about content and what is a good code and a bad code. So, I mean, I think I kind of touched on it when I mentioned within the civil room. I mean, the idea is that you could have a modernistic code for the design of a road system, or you could have a street code that would generate a neo-traditional street system. And I guess, I mean, it's one of the, it's a sort of fact of life as a researcher. We can't do everything, and then we have to specialise. And I found myself specialising in this case in working out relationships between kinds of codes and having to ignore the content temporarily. So, you know, I mean, at the break you said you wondered if what I was going to say would conflict with what you were saying. And I think my answer would probably be that they're probably complementary in the sense that all the stuff about the social content and the meaning and the, you know, and the good that you do with the code is for me, like it's almost like a separate issue
that we would be saying, well, you know, it depends what you want to do. I mean, my main concern, I suppose, at heart, was to try and work out what the code was and what it could do. And you could have a good code or a bad code, if you like, just as you could have a good plan or a bad plan, or a good design or a bad design. And of course, good and bad are in quote marks, etc., etc. You know, so like if your purpose was to design a Corbusian landscape, then you could invent code that would help you create one. But if you like Corbusian landscapes, then that'd be great. And if you don't, then it's not. But I think what this came out of originally was the idea, I referred to it briefly, that code sort of became repopularized under the new urbanist architects, let's say, and urbanists. And the problem was that, in a sense, was that the idea of these new kinds of codes and form-based codes became associated with new urbanist architecture, in a sense. And if you disagree with new urbanist architecture or architects, and call it pastiche, and all the criticisms, and seaside, you know, it's an affluent suburb, it's a resort town. Like, for me, that wasn't relevant. What was relevant was about how you could use it as an instrument in either alongside a plan or a design or as an alternative. So, I think there are obviously serious questions about legitimacy, as you say, and who's making the code and whether what it provides is a good thing or not. But as far as my own interest is concerned, well, we can all have an opinion, we can all be interested, just like, say, politics, we can all be interested in politics. But my day job isn't to be a politician. Well, you might say it should be, but we can discuss that's kind of one for the top, perhaps. But more specifically, what you said was, I agree exactly. The idea, and this is where it becomes interesting in a sense, the idea that the Corbusian's code, which I'm calling that just for reference, that many countries who may never have heard of Corbusian will design the same kind of road system, probably maybe based on the American system of roads engineering, etc., etc. But what that does is, if you look into detail, is it precisely does what you said. It redistributes accessibility in a certain way. It gives more accessibility to those who have cars, who will tend to be a certain proportion of the population, and also where those freeways need to be built somewhere. They may often be built in a place that's informal settlements or slums, or things that can be analysed as slums, and therefore you project a road through it, and you're transferring wealth and benefit from the inhabitants of the slum to the people who live in the suburbs, the affluent suburbs, who live in a car. And so I'm very aware, and that was part of my motivation for getting into the street-based urbanism. But I guess what my original point when I was looking at these things is that the problem with, in Britain we call it road hierarchy, in America they call it functional classification, in Corbusian called it 7B, you know, it's the same thing in essence. I guess my point at the time, when I originally studied this, was that the problem with road hierarchy isn't that you have the roads in a hierarchy. The problem is the content of the hierarchy. In other words, the problem isn't that it's a code. The problem is that you favour certain things in the code that give redistribution, power, and accessibility, and all of those other things. You also have the question of taste, which, I mean, again, it's a similar thing about content. Again, I wasn't really saying too much about taste. Again, the point is that you could generate a code, you could create a code that would generate, human figures and animals. And
this was highly coded.
Okay.
So we understand maybe 10% of the tail of our head.
So what I'm saying is you could have a code that generated brick buildings, or one that generated this, or both. But for me, what's interesting is the different kind of code and the relationship between what you specify, not the actual content or the meaning of what those things are. And I think, and your final point was about the urban designer and the architect. Well, I think the point there I would be making, which was in the table that I showed, if you remember the table, you could read probably. In the table it couldn't be read. The point was that there are these different scales. Now, if your intention is to create a street that has a certain character and order to it, for whatever reason, then the individual architect might have to conform with that. If you decide that the higher level object is worthy of being a thing of itself that has order of itself, now you could decide for a street not to have a setbacks, etc., and people can design what they want, and that's absolutely fine. An example I've used before is the street is like an edited book. This is for academics, right? You write books, edit books, right? The street is like an edited book where the individual the buildings are like the chapter office. And if you're the editor, so basically the street design, in a sense, is like the editor who's trying to say, well, look, it's got to be a certain size, and it's got to be a certain language, and it's got to be a certain this and that, and you should remember to have pictures and so on. Because your aim as an editor is the coherence and functionality of the whole, the larger scale object. Now, if you don't like that, then maybe you go and build your house somewhere else that doesn't have to require urban design language. You get a rich client on a greenfield site, you can build what you like, etc. I mean, that's a kind of crude answer to your question. And the final point that you were asking about the expert system and so on. Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that I didn't go into detail. It was partly sort of implicit, but the idea would be that at some level, it was the idea of the piano keyboard, and that you could have roles that fit in between the roles. So you could, in principle, have a system where if you had a series of codes of some sort, it could help non-professional designers to experiment with elements and putting stuff together in a way that maybe an expert had helped to say, well, you've got to make sure that this role connects up with that, or this, these elements connect in certain ways, or need to be related in certain ways, or you must leave this for a legal reason. But allowing them to use those building blocks so that the overall form and the final design is their design, but to make sure that the walls stand up, or the roads, the alleyway connects to the roads, otherwise you can't get the car out of that, and so on and so on. So I think they're very, but it could be, conversely, it could be that the non-experts could be helping to set the code as well. So, I haven't explored it in detail, but you would need to find the examples, or need to talk through. But you could have it where the community is helping to write the code, and that then the professional architects and designers work with. So it could feed in that way, or it could feed in the other way, where the experts write the code with the allowable relationships, etc., and then the individual designers could be non-experts. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Do people know the Michael Sorkin local codes? That's a very beautiful piece, because they don't make sense. There's no logic. But they're a provocation to the designer to operate in an open manner. I think they're brilliant because of their openness. Because of their openness. Because you can't. There's no solution to the local codes. Michael Sorkin's written. Whereas most code designers like it when their codes lead to a particular type of solution. That's why Seaside likes it. The Seaside code leads to the solution that they want. Yeah? It's a form of determinism. Whereas the codes that I like are the ones which set a certain set of generic possibilities. But there's still enough openness in them to allow the designer or the citizen to find their own spaces. And I think that's why I go back to the thing of if you develop codes of the analysis of the existing, then what people like is they feel comfortable that they have in some way made sense of the existing through a coding system. If you then use that same coding system to project, then it's still comfortable, and it still sort of has a sort of sense of inevitability about it. Because I think there has to be a kind of break between looking back, which you have to do to understand, and looking forward, which needs a different set of languages and a different set of coding possibilities.
I mean, I think there's an issue here. I mean, although I don't have a particular, I'm not particularly heated about this issue, I think there is still an element where, to some extent, I mean, you use the word comfortable, and that sometimes what people appear to want, maybe appear to want, is something traditional. I mean, you might say that the public, this is a wider argument about public taste, what kind of houses do people want to live in and so on. And I tread carefully towards that area. But I think, let me put it another way. I think there's a sense, and to try and put it slightly more in the way of your question there would be, let me put it this way. If you were like an omniscient artist, you create a one-off design out of nothing, where everything is new, like the world has never seen a brick. You're down in the workshop and you fire this thing up and you get something that becomes a brick, you know what I'm saying? So if you could create something completely unique and it's a one-off and you designed it and it's straight out of your head, you're the sort of godlike designer. And I think what the code helps to do is it kind of breaks down, because we don't normally act in that mode, right? Even though maybe some architects play it. The stereotypical architects, of course. But what the code could do, I think, which becomes more sort of participatory, democratic even, etc., is that it says, well, here are some features that a typical building would have, like walls that are vertical, windows every so often, maybe windows symmetrical with the door in the middle, I don't know. And basically what I'm saying is, you start to break down this unique object, so that it's not a unique object, but it has regularities. So you can look at two buildings and say, these both have transparent apertures in them, let's call them windows, and so on and so on. And so that, and you're helping to break down the design problem, although I'm straight into the word of problem solving, but you break down the design problem into smaller units. And those smaller units, I think, become more easily manipulable by individuals who aren't omniscient architects and don't have the skill to put together a whole building or a unique building, but they might be able to build a shed, or this is getting into some Alexandrian kind of ideas of, you can build your own shed and build your own house and so on. And okay, yes, it is in some senses conservative in the sense that it's using elements that are familiar. They're not inventing a new thing that is like an architect would invent that kind of thing that's halfway between a wall and a roof. And it's not that it's on the cover of the architectural journal because, is it a wall? Is it a roof? What is it? But that's one in a million buildings. But for the other 99% of buildings, a vertical wall is a good idea. And so it could, anyway, you see what I'm saying. Anyway, it's just a thought. It breaks down the problem into smaller items that allows more people to engage with the acts of design, and especially at the urban scale, because in some ways a building has to be designed together, because structurally it has to.
We should ask questions from
just finally the urban thing. Because towns are built, because towns lend themselves to being built incrementally, then a code could help to manage over the design over time in a way that wouldn't make sense for the building, because you have to anticipate the need for a roof from day one.
Any observations from the doctoral students?
No, but maybe I don't know. You said that we need like a break between the code of analysis and the code of projecting. But maybe sometimes the code is useful for us just to understand our thoughts, and we, as an architect, maybe have to give people an instrument or a code to translate the results. So I have unsolved that.
But is what you give them enough? Is my only question.
No.
Because I mean the classic system of coding is the plan. Now, it really depends, as Stephen was saying, on how you use the plan. If you use the plan simply as a formal device, and you explain to your client the plan as a formal device, and it's 4 square and it's got a corner, and it's simply a formal device, then I would say that's not enough. Whereas if you describe the plan as a set of stories which then relate to the